Construction Playbook podcast with Pagabo in partnership with the Open University.
What the toolkit does is it gives a client a way to define those outcomes in that value profile. It gives them a way to build it into their procurement and into their commercial strategy. It gives consultants a way to target and focus their designs on the achievement of those outcomes, but it also gives contractors a way to focus their efforts when constructing and delivering projects and programs.
Welcome to the Construction Playbook podcast with Pagabo in partnership with the Open University, with me, Gerard Toplass, Group Chief Executive of Pagabo. There are many challenges that face our sector, and today we're talking about the government's long-awaited Value Toolkit, which they hope will address many of these challenges. They are hoping that their Value Toolkit will kickstart a move, even a drive to a proper acknowledgement and recognition of the value and the power that public spending on infrastructure and the built environment can deliver.
The Construction Playbook podcast with Pagabo.
So today I have with me my two very special guests, Ellie Jenkins, the Industry Project Lead for the Value Toolkit, and also a partner at Acknowledgement, and Conor McCarthy, an Associate Director at WSP. He's here today because he's been involved in the R&D of the toolkit. So I think we've got the two best people to help us understand this today. Right then, let's start with, Ellie, what is the Value Toolkit? What's the point of it? Why? What are the expected benefits and to whom?
Of course, yeah. So if we start with the why, it's often the place we start conversations, both client and market side, in terms of the Value Toolkit. And the whys are quite clear for me in terms of drivers. Clients are operating in an increasingly complex policy landscape, and they need a tool that enables them to translate policy into outcomes for every investment with a clear line between those policies and those outcomes. The Construction Playbook is a really great document for setting out the future and how we move forward. What the Value Toolkit does is give you the tools to be able to enact the Construction Playbook.
So when you say the tools, do you want to just expand a little bit?
Of course. So the Value Toolkit is, in its simplest terms, a series of steps or activities that a client would undertake throughout the asset lifecycle. So starting right at the earliest stages of investment decision making, all the way through the asset lifecycle to make sure that they can make value-based decisions throughout.
So Conor, you're flying the flag for the users. Do you see it exactly as Ellie has explained it, or give us your perspective on what it is?
I think I agree with Ellie in the sense that it really will help bring a clearer articulation of value and bring that to market. I think as WSP, for example, as a multinational, multidisciplinary design consultancy and advisory services business, we benefit from having a clear understanding of what a client's really looking for and what they value. And I think being able to bring that back into what we do as a business, but also as the industry, can only help us improve delivery and ensure outcomes that a client is seeking are actually delivered.
I like the point that you made about the client, Ellie, specifically, because that's quite a big move for them. And I hear Conor's perspective from the contractor. Do you see the two things working together? Are there any, is it a frictionless sort of alignment or not in your view?
I think it's a massive step forward, both from the client and the market side. If clients are able to clearly articulate, as Conor said, what's important to them, then the market are already telling us that they will innovate solutions to respond. And that's both on the consultancy side and the contractor side. So I think it's quite an exciting space to be in, and we'll certainly look forward to seeing how it's rolled out. The
innovation piece is particularly relevant because the Construction Playbook tells us we must, as an industry, innovate. We must use technology, we must innovate, we must consider a whole host of these things. So, Ellie, you're the lead now for Construction Innovation Hub. Can you just open the sort of envelope a little bit and tell us, what's been invested? Can you give us any idea on the sort of funding that's been put in place and the resources put behind it?
So the Construction Innovation Hub is funded by UKRI, and it was a £72 million 4-year programme. And that ran across quite a variety of areas. So it looked at digital transformation, it looked at how we move towards platform-based solutions, it looked towards international export, assurance, and then value was a theme that sits within that bracket. So I can't give you the specific figures because obviously the programme is still underway. But what I will say is that it represents a significant investment from government's perspective in taking value-based decision making forward. But I'd also draw your attention to the fact that industry have also invested a huge amount of time, and I'm sure Connor will testify to that fact as to how much WSP have invested, but in getting their teams upskilled, in being part of the pilot, in being part of the R&D, industry have also put forward a significant amount of resource to make it come to life.
Yeah, I mean, Ellie's point is very valid there. I mean, investment isn't just pounds and pence, is it? It's about the time that people put in. So, Connor, I mean, has it been a significant investment at WSP and the other industry players as well?
I think it has, Gerard. I mean, there's quite a range of different elements of the industry, be it contractors, consultants, contributing to the development, and a lot of time and effort went into supporting the development of the toolkit. But then obviously in the back of businesses, there's a lot going on to prepare for the Value Toolkit coming out. So identifying how it's going to impact on our service offerings, what clients will be looking for, how can we assist clients more, how can we learn to facilitate and the toolkit itself, but also how can we start to train our business to respond to it when it does actually come to market.
That's a great response, that, Connor. So let's just talk about, when it's going to be available. I mean, Ellie, you've mentioned, or you've noted that the Value Toolkit is a number of steps or a methodology. So the $64 billion question, or in our case, our industry is worth £110 billion. When will we see it more widely adopted? What is your programme to move it away from possibly the pilot that Connor and his team and others are working on into the mainstream industry?
So let me talk you through the steps that we're going through at the moment. So we went through 18 months worth of technical development, of which Connor was a significant part. And in April, we moved into pilot phase. So we're working with over 140 early implementers to really kick the tyres in anger on the Value Toolkit. So that pilot comes to an end at the end of November, and we'll then have a few weeks of collating all of the technical feedback, but also the facilitation and training feedback that runs alongside the pilot. We'll then go into a period of technical iteration where we'll be working with our technical teams to be able to improve and refine the Value Toolkit with an aim of launching in spring 2022. Now, I would love to sit on the podcast and give you a very specific date in March that you could hold me to, Gerard, but I can't quite do that just yet. But I promise you'll be the first to know as soon as we've got that date.
No, I mean, at Pagabo and our other businesses, we develop a lot of technology, so we understand that point. And, I think you've approached it properly, actually, having a pilot phase and then iterating forward, because that's the way it does. And when you release it in spring next year, that will just be the starting line, won't it? You will then be moving on from that and taking on sort of additional sort of changes. Connor, are you preparing for implementation? Have you got clients ready to go?
Yes, as I mentioned previously, we're trying to understand what the toolkit means for clients and for our business. We are preparing in the sense that we are starting to get people trained up. We're starting to understand what it means for our own internal processes. We're also working with clients and identifying where clients would seek to use the Value Toolkit and how we can support them in the coming months and in next year when it is released to market.
Is that the methodology, Connor, or are you doing any early testing on any sort of software type tools as well?
So it's mostly just the methodology, Gerard. I think that the toolkit as a framework itself provides the methodology to just pick it up and deliver or facilitate the service to the client. I think in time you might find other third-party tools which will support it and will feed into it kind of being used. An example probably is Pagabo's Loop. I believe if a client uses the toolkit to define their outcomes and their value profile and to then build that into contracts, for example, or procurement, then for example, if a client had procured through Pagabo and they were monitoring the various outcomes that were developed through the Value Toolkit, they would potentially use Loop to do that. And that information then would be fed back up into the toolkit and collated with other elements and other measures to give the overall view of how that value is being delivered.
That's great, that, Connor. What would be really useful for the listeners is to understand some of those steps that are actually in the Value Toolkit. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Can, of course, Gerard. So I suppose the start of the toolkit is all about trying to define the client's value profile and working through their strategic value drivers and developing a set of outcome statements which reflect those value drivers, and then building that into a sort of prioritized view of value, which is termed the value profile. At the same time, you're working through the client approach stream and looking at the client profile, trying to understand the client's attitudes and characteristics and where they want to be. You're also looking at some strategic risk elements and also looking at some of the strategic metrics that you want to measure as a client in response to those outcomes. As you progress on down through the toolkit then and through that framework, you start to look at defining the delivery model and what's the way you want to engage with market as the client. You then look to subsequently commercialize that, but also build a value index, which in some ways is a points-based version of a value profile, and it gives a baseline to allow the measurement of value against that value profile. These kind of activities will run kind of in parallel with the HM Treasury business case development and also the various different stages within the project or program lifecycle.
Ellie, just moving on from Connor then, in this series of podcasts, we talked a lot about early engagements. Where do you see the Value Toolkit being used most? Is it in the OBC, strategic OBC? How do you see it being used? Or when, should I say, do you see it being used?
I think it's a really interesting question. So through the pilot stage, we've seen the Value Toolkit tested across various stages. The one thing that I can tell you is the earlier the Value Toolkit is used, the better from our perspective. So if you can get it in right from those early concept stages, from REBA stage 0 and onwards, then that's what we would strongly advocate for. That said, what we've learned through the pilot is that if you haven't done that and you get further through the REBA stages and you want to use it as an opportunity to pause, to reflect, to ensure that you have got the right outcomes identified, I'd still encourage clients to do that. It's probably not too late, even as you're getting into REBA stage 3, to start looking at that. But the sooner you can, certainly the better from our perspective.
So your message is, if you haven't had that early engagement, don't worry too much. You can still adopt the principles. Connor mentioned one of our products, which is Loop, and that's actually a social value calculator. So an element of it is in the value piece. But as a framework manager, we are integrating the Construction Playbook into everything we do. We all of our frameworks are predicated on value, efficiency, and with Loop, obviously, social value. So, do you see framework providers as being a real sort of organisation who do the heavy lifting, Ellie?
I certainly do, yeah. We've got really strong relationships across the frameworks, and I think frameworks play a critical role in supporting clients through that value-based decision making. So I certainly see that there is absolutely a role for the likes of Pagabo there.
And Connor, have you engaged on, Pagabo isn't the only framework provider in the UK. So are you seeing Ellie's point come to fruition, the importance of frameworks?
We haven't had any direct engagement with frameworks in terms of testing toolkits so far, but I would agree with Ellie. I think as one of the main routes to market for a lot of major civil engineering infrastructure works, it will be, I suppose, paramount to the role of the toolkit. And for a framework to be able to respond to a client's value profile and their requirements and outcomes will certainly help the client to deliver those.
So obviously, it's great to hear from Ellie and Connor that framework providers are going to be really sort of key to helping get the value toolkit into the sector. So, obviously, we as a framework provider are very interested in bringing technology into play, because digital first construction is integral into what the playbook says, and it's obviously the way forward for our industry. So will there be tools, software tools, and what may they look like? And will you be wanting the framework providers to try and engage very early with those, Ellie?
So there is a web app that runs alongside the Value Toolkit, and currently the proof of concept for the web app covers 2 streams of activity within the Value Toolkit. So it covers the value definition stream, which helps clients articulate what value means to them, and it covers the measurement and evaluation stream, which helps clients to set metrics, performance ranges, and compare options against that initial value profile. So the web app should be fully up and running and functional by the time we go to launch. And it should be there to support clients in just making the process a bit easier to run, a bit more streamlined.
Well, that's great, and obviously we'd want to be there with you when you're ready to do that. Some of the work we're doing with the DFT around social value is around optioneering, and I see technology being very good at providing those options quite quickly for clients. WSP, Connor, are you really driving technology in your business, and do you see the Value Toolkit as part of that ecosystem?
I think we are. We are very much concentrating on digital and that innovation and what it can bring to our delivery across the board, across all the various disciplines that we would be involved in. I think the toolkit will ultimately form part of it in some fashion in the future. shifting towards an outcome-based approach means that we do need to measure outcomes and delivery against outcomes more going forward. It's not just cost and time. So therefore, while a schedule is important, measuring against the schedule baseline is not the only measure we're now going to be asked, or a budget. I think finding a way to use technology to make that simpler when we design something, for example, to be able to understand the embodied carbon very quickly and understand how that relates to maybe an outcome that a client has set in relation to reducing that embodied carbon, then that will help us as designers and consultants.
I think, Gerard, it's probably worth noting at this point that the Value Toolkit's web app will link really naturally into other tools. So within the Value Toolkit, we don't dictate metrics. What we do is we signpost to available metrics that are consistently used and accepted within the sector. And we also provide a space where clients can go and put the data back in, but we're not a measurement tool in that sense. So what I see is a really natural link between the Value Toolkit's web app and the digital tools that already exist in the marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of for social value specifically, you've obviously got things like TOMS, which is one standard. You've got Loop's standard. You've got UN SDGs. You've got the PPN 0620, you've got a bunch of sort of stuff monetised and non-monetised. So it'd be great to see all of those sort of being integrated and sort of doing that. I mean, technology, I think Connor's sort of raised the point there, and it's absolutely valid. If we're going to help clients understand their decisions very quickly or more quickly, then technology is going to allow us to actually drive that forward. I mean, our industry has been great at using technology in the design stages, but less so at the early stages, and certainly probably less so afterwards. And I think the Value Toolkit and the Construction Playbook are both going to help us sort of drive into that. I also want to pick up on your point, Connor, about carbon. I mean, COP26 has been happening very recently, and promises are being thrown around like confetti at the moment, environmentally friendly, of course. Does the Value Toolkit have a real role in climate change management, net zero, etc.? I mean, how are you seeing that at WSP?
I think it does, Gerard, but I think it goes wider than just the decarbonisation agenda. Adopting an outcome-based approach will really be as strong as developing the outcomes and measuring them and building them into contracts and delivery. What the toolkit does is it gives a client a way to define those outcomes and that value profile. It gives them a way to build it into their procurement and into their commercial strategy. It gives consultants like WSP a way to target and focus their designs on the achievement of those outcomes, but it also gives contractors a way to focus their efforts when constructing and delivering projects and programs in a way that delivers those outcomes as a priority. I think it goes beyond that though as well. I think it goes into the reward and incentivization, and it incentivizes clients to look at value differently, incentivizes contractors to look about how they deliver it differently. And if you, for example, have an outcome statement about decarbonising the local transport network, for example, setting up a commercial strategy which rewards clients for delivering on your target performance as a client against a set of outcomes, but also incentivizes them to go further where they can. It focuses then a contractor on seeing, well, maybe we can make a little bit of extra difference here, or a consultant about maybe we can tweak our design a bit further here to reduce that carbon. And I think collectively, I think that as a whole offering really should help clients move towards that outcome-based approach.
Yeah, I like your point about incentivizing. We did cover a whole area of that in contract management, actually, in one of the earlier sort of podcasts, because if you use the NEC, for example, that does allow you to introduce a whole range of incentives to actually achieve your objectives. So I think that's really valid. Yeah, we talked a lot about outcomes at the beginning, the specification, the outcomes that the client wants to see happen with their project. But obviously there's a big move as well now into whole life costing, looking at the overall value. Ellie, is the toolkit looking post-construction when it's been handed over? Because buildings have a 5, 10, 15, 100-year life. And particularly around carbon, we can see a real opportunity to reduce that carbon. And, do you see the Value Toolkit helping in that longer-term decision-making for clients?
I certainly do, and I think it's absolutely critical that whether we're looking at carbon, at costing, at social value, we are taking that whole life approach. So on a personal level, it's a really important thing that we need to be driving forward on as a sector. Through the Value Toolkit, we absolutely look at that whole life lens. So when a client creates a value profile, they're creating a value profile that covers both the delivery phase, but also the in-use phase of that asset. So it is absolutely embedded. And what's really interesting to see through the pilot is some of the clients that are probably more advanced in their value-based thinking are already looking at placing the priority, their weightings on that in-use phase. So that's been a real learning for me to see. But yes, I'm really pleased to say that the Value Toolkit does cover both phases.
Yeah, I mean, just from a procurement perspective, we're seeing the same actually, Ellie. There's been a big push by the CLC and the team there about considering whole life costing. And what I hope to see post COP26, I hope to see reality rather than rhetoric. The politicians obviously are standing up and making promises. And we as a sector really probably need to hold them to account. Okay, you've asked us to make changes. These are the tools, the Value Toolkit and others, which allow us to demonstrate those. Are you prepared to foot the bill for it? Because there is a bill. Let's be honest about it. I mean, Connor, you will be costing fairly large jobs. Are you? When you start to factor these in, when you use value-based, does it have an impact on costing?
I think that's a tough question to answer just now, Gerard. Until we see it built into an ITT and a tender from a client, it's very, very difficult to understand the implications. We know there will be a cost associated with it, but we hope, I think as well, that the payment mechanisms and the rewards will change in relation to delivery of those outcomes. So therefore, while there might be additional cost, the way we would be paid, shall we say, may shift us also to recompense or remunerate against that.
So that contract management, that incentive approach, could actually be used. So the carrot and the stick, and maybe that's not the right terminology, but the idea being that, okay, yes, the project's going to cost this X, but if you drive us on and reduce the carbon or have these particular outcomes, you may get paid more. And you think that will start to come in, Connor?
I certainly hope so, because I think it will help to focus the whole supply chain on delivering the right objectives and the right outcomes.
Okay. You mentioned supply chain there, and again, it's through the Construction Playbook. Contractors and prime organisations must get their whole ecosystem, their whole supply chain involved. The Value Toolkit, I mean, we've got WSP on the call here, Ellie. I mean, I know some of the tier ones are very closely aligned to what you're doing. Are you working with the SMEs and the people behind it? Because remember, in our industry, 66-70% of the work is actually done by micro SMEs and one or two people bands. So have you done any thought process on that?
So yeah, we're certainly trying to cascade down to work with the SMEs as well. On the early implementer group that we have a huge number of large-scale consultancies and a huge number of large-scale tier one contractors. But there are also some really interesting, particularly SME consultants in the space that are piloting the Value Toolkit and seeing how it works. We also have a piece of technical development work that's happening in the background alongside the pilot, which is looking at the tender evaluation process. And it's saying if clients start to ask for value differently, can a tier one contractor respond, and how would they then cascade that down through their supply chain? So that is a piece of technical development work that is very much underway at the moment.
So let's just talk a little bit from a different perspective then. The Value Toolkit has got all of these absolutely fantastic outcomes for clients and probably for all stakeholders, including users of buildings. But let's just talk a little bit about some of the things that happen in our industry when a new idea or a new methodology is put forward, particularly in an industry where we're extremely busy, where there's plenty of work at the moment. And I suppose it's a little bit on to what's the cost to get involved and not what's the pounds and pence, because Ellie, you probably don't know what that is yet, but we've also talked a little bit about the resources. Are you worried that some organisations may actually say, well, hang on a second, there's a lot of bureaucracy here, and particularly if it's being driven by the centre? Is there a worry? Have you thought about that, and what steps are you taking or going to take to try and mitigate that?
So our intention is certainly for the Value Toolkit to be rolled out at scale, and to do that there will be costs to delivering the Value Toolkit. The main cost that we can see is that we want people to be well trained and competent and able to consistently deliver that process for clients. So we expect that there will be certified facilitator training, and there will be a cost to the industry of becoming a certified facilitator. I can't give you an exact figure of what that will look like at the moment, but it is something that we're going through a process of cost modelling. And I would say with all of the major UK consultancies on board as early implementers, we've certainly got a good group to go and market test those costs with and make sure that they're not going to be prohibitive to wide-scale adoption.
Yeah, I mean training. I mean you've touched on it there, and this every day is a training day in CPD. I mean our industry is pretty good at accepting that. I suppose the concern would be that larger organisations that get the larger contracts can amortise that or absorb it. It's the smaller companies, and what we don't want, because we rely on the smaller businesses in our sector, as we know, 2/3, maybe more, actually doing the work every day. We just, I guess, need to ensure we don't leave them out. But it sounds like you've thought about it, and let's see how that develops. Let's just talk a little bit about whether the Value Toolkit is got an opportunity abroad. I mean, we are now working in other countries, actually, as Pagabo and our businesses. And it may surprise you, it may not surprise you, but social value, for example, is actually, the UK is one of the leaders in social value management and understanding and measurement. So, and there are other countries looking at the way we do frameworks as well, because tendering is quite different in a lot of countries. Do you see the Value Toolkit being implemented in other countries? Have you had any contact, Connor?
I have, Gerard. I've had several conversations with colleagues and clients globally who've either seen or heard about the Value Toolkit through social media, LinkedIn, for example. They are very keen to understand more and understand what the benefits would be for them as clients, but also where we can support our clients globally as well. I think the first step is obviously to ensure that it's delivered within the UK and we get some successful feedback, which we can then share with people internationally. And I have no doubt that international usage will follow in time.
Ellie, have you seen the same?
We have, yes, certainly from a hub perspective. Like Connor said, our focus very much at the moment is ensuring we have a workable solution that works for the UK market. But last year we ran a webinar that was attended by over 17 countries, and there were significant levels of interest, particularly from the countries that have similar procurement processes to us or follow a similar version to the Green Book. So we recognise that there are key opportunities, particularly within Canada, within New Zealand and Australia, but also within some of the European nations that are very progressive in their approach to sustainability and value-based decision, like Amsterdam and the Netherlands, for example. So yes, there's definitely opportunities internationally, but at the moment our focus is on just making sure we've got a tool that can work in the UK sector.
No, well, I understand that. Prioritising, that's certainly the right thing to do, Ellie. But I mean, we shouldn't forget about that, because I've certainly seen social value measurement being really important outside of the UK, and value-based decision-making, which is what social value measurement helps you start that process. And the Value Toolkit is certainly bringing a wider methodology to that. So I hope we can, because if we can actually take stuff into the wider world, that's greater for people who innovate, who develop technologies, develop stuff in the UK, and that can only be a good thing for our sort of construction sector. I want to sort of bring it to a close a little bit, and I'm going to do two things really. One, I'm going to ask you a final question. And I do this on all of our podcasts. So it's all about, what is your top tip that you think our listeners need to consider about the Value Toolkit? So I'm going to ask Connor first. What's your top tip?
I suppose it would be to recognise and remember that it's a holistic framework. It is not just social value. It's much wider than that. It does extend to cost and time as well, if needs be. So I suppose, approach it with an open mind and use it to support your delivery of an outcome-based approach.
Okay, and Ellie?
I think we've almost already covered it, Gerard, but for me, it's all around early engagement. So the sooner clients start thinking about the outcomes that they want to achieve, the better from my perspective.
Okay. So we've had a great time listening to, or discussing between us actually, the Value Toolkit in the context of the Construction Playbook. And I'm going to do something that I don't normally do actually on these podcasts, but because of the importance of it, Ellie, I'm going to say, look, if people want to get in touch, particularly around the Construction Innovation Hub, how can they get in touch? Can they get onto your next programme? And if so, who should they contact? Can you give us some advice on that?
Of course I can. So a core part of my role is the industry-facing side. So for the Value Toolkit, just come to me and I'll try and signpost you to the best place if it isn't me.
So those 2.7 million people in our sector can just send you an email next week. That is on the assumption 2.7 million people listen to our podcast, by the way, but so it might be slightly less. No, look, thank you very much. So I just want to say a big thank you to my guest today, Ellie Jenkins, the industry project lead for the Value Toolkit and also partner at Ackaloff, and Connor McCarthy, an associate director at WSP. And it's just been a great time. This is one of our podcasts. We've got a series of 8 podcasts, and please carry on listening. We'll see you again soon.